So Steins Gate is a thing. You know, Steins Gate, like a gate to Steins.
What in the hell is a Steins Gate?
Okay, so the words don't actually mean anything, but the show itself is incredible. This is one of those rare shows that I can watch over and over again and always find new things to appreciate. The polished anime look that makes the characters seem even more realistic. Each character, even side characters, are given complex motives and often hint at darker undertones. The show is super comedic, sarcastic, and lighthearted, except for, you know, all the moments where it's none of those things, and people are brutally murdered because of a global corporate conspiracy. Oh yeah, that's a thing. The movie continues that story, but with Makise Kurisu as the main character, so we get to see things from her perspective. And despite my early misgivings about the sequel, I really loved the spin-off / second season called Steins Gate Zero. All of these things make Steins Gate amazing, but the thing that makes it next level exceptional is how the show deals with time travel. I know that I'm gonna piss off a bunch of people by saying this, but I highly recommend watching this show dubbed rather than with subtitles. But that's sacrilege, I hear you protest. You have to watch anime in its original untouched Japanese. Well, first off, no, you don't. Preference is a thing. But more importantly, this show moves so incredibly fast that having English audio and subtitles is probably the best way to watch this show in order to keep up with everything that's happening. This is particularly evident in the dialogue of Steins Gate. The story is written with smart, witty, clever, often sardonic and sarcastic characters whose back and forth repartee are always riddled with references to both Western and Japanese pop culture, while they talk about their interpersonal drama, ranging from the trivial to the truly heartwarming. But all of the dialogue is important because this is where a lot of the action of the show takes place. They actually rarely ever leave this one room, so you can tell that the show's not going to have a lot of action. This means the show relies heavily on the dialogue to achieve most of its goals. This works incredibly well for Steins Gate because of how truly well written the characters and dialogue are in regards to dealing with the subject matter. The show blends a lot of elements. The aforementioned comedy and subtle secondary romance plot. Along with that, there is a fast-paced conspiracy, and most importantly, the subject of today's discussion, the way the scientific and philosophical concepts presented are explored by the characters and plot in Steins Gate. All of the ideas presented in Steins Gate, its movie and its second season, are plausible explorations based on very real science and rooted in current ideological arguments of space and time in regards to time travel. Also, I just want an excuse to talk about how freaking good these shows and movie are. And so today, I want to talk about Steins Gate. Steins Gate was actually not originally an anime. It was a visual novel, which is a kind of video game that leads heavily on plot rather than gameplay to engage the player. Not that there can't be interactive gameplay options that can change the story, or fuck with the player. Fucking Doki Doki Literature Club. Created by Nitro Plus and 5BP Inc., Steins Gate was originally envisioned as part of a trilogy of non-connected or loosely connected visual novels. It appeared after Chaos Head and was followed by Robotics Notes. Each of these was envisioned to have a different tone and different gameplay mechanics, with Chaos Head as horror, while Robotics Notes leaned heavily into the physical science fiction rather than the philosophical science fiction of Steins Gate. The heavy involvement of time travel as a playable mechanic to change past decisions and the effects that has on the present and future of the story as they cause branching timelines lend themselves easily to the branching story arcs inherent in the visual novel style. As a result of this, plus spectacular writing and excellent characters, Steins Gate was easily the most popular of the trilogy. The game was released in 2009, and everyone took notice. It has since been ported numerous times and spawned several manga adaptations. In 2011, an anime was released based on the canonical timeline of the visual novel, but hinted or often showed other possibilities throughout the season. In 2013, a direct sequel in the form of a movie came out. A follow-up game called Steins Gate Zero was released in 2015, and was also adapted into both manga and anime. A few other visual novels were released, such as Steins Gate My Darling's Embrace, which does away with the sci-fi in favor of interacting with and possibly wooing all of your favorite Steins Gate characters. So with all of this media having come out, why is it that you may not have heard of this franchise before? I don't know. What I look like? I'll have all the answers? I'm not here to judge. But if you are looking for how to watch this show, watch it in order of its release, not its narrative order. This is just my guess, but the narrative order gets really weird. Like, you have to watch all of Steins Gate up to and including episode 23, stop and then watch Steins Gate 0, then you stop at episode 15, watch the Valentine's Day OVA, then finish all of Steins Gate 0, return for the last 2 episodes of Steins Gate, then the OVA for that season, sometimes referred to as episode 25, and then you watch the movie. Fucking time travel makes narrative cohesion stupid. But if you haven't heard of Steins Gate, or if it's on your list and you haven't got around to it, then this is your one and only spoiler warning. But do take this warning seriously, because as with many thrillers or conspiracies, the twists and turns are best when you don't see them coming. You have been warned! For the purposes of brevity and ease, I will only be going over the 2 seasons of the anime and the movie. The first season, known as Steins Gate, follows Okabe Rintaro, the highly intelligent, self-proclaimed full-time supervillain and part-time university student, as he hangs out with his friends in his apartment, which he calls the Future Gadget Laboratory. Mostly toying with useless inventions for the fun of being together, Okabe also has a keen interest in the ideas of time travel, and the lab has been working on its latest invention.
This humble kitchen appliance is a time machine.
During this time, Okabe attends a lecture where he meets one Makiase Kurisu, a brilliant young researcher in the field of cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, only to hear a scream minutes later and come upon her body bleeding out in a closet. Later that day, after sending a text message, Okabe is suddenly shaken for a moment as though he's experiencing severe deja vu. He discovers a satellite had crashed into the university building. The lecture he had attended had been cancelled, and he never ended up attending even though he still has all his memories of those events. What's more, Makiase Kurisu is alive and well. Kurisu quickly becomes a member of the Future Gadget Lab, and they begin to discover a plot leading towards World War III involving the use of time machines. Many crazy twists and turns come about until Okabe gets to a point where he has to decide whether or not he can live in a timeline without his childhood friend, Shina Mayuri, or the woman he has come to love, Makiase Kurisu herself. In the movie, Okabe's choice to find a way to save both Mayuri and Kurisu worked, but now they have no memory of what transpired in the 3 weeks of August 2010, meaning that Kurisu does not remember their relationship or anything about Okabe beyond a few minor exchanges they had. However, when Okabe disappears suddenly, she feels something is missing, but cannot remember what because he's literally stopped existing. She discovers that the emptiness she is feeling is because she can sort of remember a different timeline where Okabe did exist, but because he leapt through so many timelines, he can't seem to stay locked into a specific timeline. Kurisu goes into the past and anchors him to this timeline with a solid memory that changed his life. She gives him the idea to become this self-proclaimed mad scientist. Also, she kisses him in the process, but the whole operation is successful. Here's where things get real tricky. Steins Gate 0 takes place after the events of Steins Gate, but in a timeline where Okabe is unwilling to risk any more time travel and damage to his own mental health to save Kurisu. So when we see Okabe and his friends 6 months later, Mayuri is alive, but Okabe is really messed up. His mental health is shattered because of all the time travel and horrible things he had to witness. He is slowly trying to put his life back together emotionally, and he frequently references the fact that he's in therapy. The fact that Okabe did not save Kurisu means that this timeline where they're in is still destined to devolve into World War III. Through his interaction with some of Kurisu's old colleagues and an artificial intelligence made up of her memories, Okabe is once again launched into a world of espionage and subterfuge, while governments, corporations, and other global superpowers attempt to compete for the information that he and the artificial Kurisu might have for creating a working time machine. In the end, Okabe goes into a coma and wakes up years later in the midst of World War III, but using his knowledge of how time works, he creates and records a message for his past self. This is the same message we actually see in the second last episode of the first season of Steins Gate. The message convinces past Okabe to create a paradox to convince past Okabe that what he is seeing is in fact real, setting the events of everything over again for his past self to experience, but keep the world in a new timeline where everyone gets to live and there is no war. Did you follow all of that?
Working hypothesis. Reality and my brain are at odds.
So why go into so much detail about how the show's plot works? I don't normally spoil so much, but in this case, it's important because I want to talk about the philosophy of how time travel is portrayed in the show, and that means you need some idea of how it works. It is interesting that corporeal time travel is introduced late in the show and is almost barely used. That isn't to say that nobody travels through time, but it's the effects of their temporal interference that are felt immediately as a result of their actions. Or in other words, the butterfly effect reaches out from the past to the present, and they experience the shift as though it already happened and played out up to the present. The first time machine that the characters create is called the phone wave, real name TBA. Yes, that's the whole name, and that's how they refer to it. With this invention, the lab members are able to send text messages into the past. The only person who can perceive the effects of this is Okabe, who is able to keep his memories of other timelines when the causal distortions in time shift everything to a new timeline to match up with the actions caused by thrusting information into the past. But we are not just dealing with standard progression of causal events.
You have to let go of this idea of time as a single line moving from past to future. It's actually comprised of infinite lines all running parallel. We call these world lines.
The idea of timelines has become relatively popular in pop culture. Infinite versions of reality existing all in the same space but divided by time or
vibrate at a different frequency so they can't see one another.
But the original idea came from a physicist named Dr. Hugh Everett III. His many worlds interpretation was proposed as an alternative way of answering the problem of superpositions postulated by the famous Schrödinger's cat experiment.
Are those cats?
I assume they're Schrodinger's cats. Actually, I assume they both are and aren't.
The idea was that if you place a cat inside a box with poison and then seal that box off, you can no longer reasonably discern whether the cat is alive or dead. You can certainly make estimations, but there's no way of knowing until an observation is made. In this specific case, that would be opening the box. This is known as a superposition. The reigning theory at the time, called the Copenhagen interpretation, stated that the superposition would resolve itself once an observation was made. But until then, the cat would occupy a state of being both alive and dead until observed, and only then could the observer discern whether the cat had been or was one or the other. But Hugh Everett's idea differed. He stated that instead of a superposition resolving, it was possible that there were multiple worlds playing out in parallel to our own, in which the opposite outcome of what happened in our world happened in those other worlds. Or any decision or event causes a superposition, which can then all be resolved into differing outcomes. And even though we will only experience one of those in our world, there are other versions that are just as real or possible as what is occurring in this world. Steins Gate refers to these as world lines, but the word timelines is also appropriate. To compound the problem, these decisions are not just binary outcomes. Any decision would create boundless possibilities which all lead to other world lines. The episode Remedial Chaos Theory of Community does a great job of explaining this.
Okay, starting on my left with 1, your number comes up, you go.
Just so you know, Jeff, you are now creating 6 different timelines.
Of course I am, Abed.
In the end, however, instead of just letting the dice land on one of its 6 sides, Abed catches it, causing another 7th timeline. In reality, every time the dice lands, where it lands, how it lands, who might catch it, what it would bounce off, all create an innumerable number of outcomes. Some of these tiny, insignificant variations would then cause chain reactions into larger outcomes. So essentially, every decision you make causes an infinite number of different timelines to be created.
That's chaos theory.
Meaning some of the world lines would actually be very similar to another, only changing a couple of variables. Steins Gate explains this by saying that certain world lines are bound together, separated by only minute changes, like smaller fibers or strings that make up a larger wound rope. It requires a large amount of energy to create or splinter or shift into another timeline that doesn't lead towards the same outcomes. In the words of Steins Gate, any grouping of world lines has an attractor field that keeps similar timelines bound together. This makes sense given how gravity bends space and time, so a large enough event would have enough gravity or energy to bend space and time to create a new secondary group of world lines leading to different outcomes. A beta world line with its own attractor field that is separate from the alpha world line and its attractor field. This all checks out, by the way. The way the show talks about Kerr black holes as a means of energy to bend space and time has been thrown around in philosophy and physics. When Okabe undoes enough of the damage caused by using the phone wave, real name TBA, he jumps to a world line where he can avoid Mayuri's death because he has escaped the attractor field that was leading towards that outcome. But this new beta line is one where Makyusei Kurisu is the one that dies, and he has to create a third world line where they can both live, a world line he calls Steins Gate. In Steins Gate 0, the show, we see a different timeline in which Okabe decided that he could no longer continue to time travel to save Makyusei Kurisu, because everything he attempted to do to save everyone didn't matter. He is no longer willing to risk his own mental health further or damaging anyone else or any other timelines to save his friends or his own timeline. The result is that he never reaches this Steins Gate world line where Makyusei Kurisu and Mayuri are both alive and World War III was evaded. Okabe's mindset of it not mattering is our primary interest. More recently than Everett, another philosopher named David Lewis wrote a super dope-ass book called On the Plurality of Worlds. Or at least that's the book that I have. He may have posited this idea before this particular publication. On the Plurality of Worlds is a deep dive into and a defense of Lewis's idea of modal realism, which is essentially the idea that there are an infinite number of possible worlds that are parallel to our own actual world. It's called that because this is what is actual to this particular version of himself and his world mates. These are his terms, definitions, and neologisms. In his book, Lewis argues against the idea of indifference in regards to the morality of possible worlds, or in the case of Steins Gate, world lines. Robert M. Adams rebukes Lewis's theory on the grounds that if there are infinite possible worlds, timelines or world lines or dimensions or whatever you want to call them, then why should I or anyone care about what happens to this particular world line out of any of the others? Any decision I make in my world line, the actual world, would cause other differing effects in those other possible worlds. Ergo, if I make a good beneficial decision to this world line, there would be negative ramifications in other world lines. Indifference towards other world lines would be impossible if every action I make has consequences in the actual world and then innumerable possible worlds. There would be no way to ever do the right thing. This seems to be the place we find Okabe in mentally when Steins Gate Zero begins, implied by his edgy new all-black wardrobe. It also seems to be a compelling argument, and one that another mad scientist might even agree with.
Nobody gets it. Nothing you think matters. This isn't special. This is happening infinite times across infinite realities.
Including this?
Yes!
This view of right and wrong is utilitarian and is based solely on reducing the badness or suffering in the whole of the world, or universe in this case. If all possible worlds or timelines are now considered the whole universe, then yes, it could be argued that everything done to reduce the suffering in the sum of all timelines would be impossible, as other timelines would always have opposite actions to your good ones, and the sum total of suffering to non-suffering would be zero, balanced out by all those actions. So nothing you do matters. For Lewis, travel between timelines was not really what he was considering, but even if it was, Lewis never claims to be indifferent towards other timelines. Instead, his rebuttal to this argument is the assumption in the argument that only one person is making any decisions rather than everyone. Every autonomous being is a decider, and they all have effects on one another. Which leads Lewis to his most important point. Any person, actual or possible in his terms, or in this world line or any other, to use the show's terms, should and likely does have what Lewis calls an egocentric want. Lewis uses the example of he himself writing his book on the plurality of worlds to explain this idea. He says that his wants, moral or otherwise, should not be hindered by the wants of others, whether those others are in his timeline or any else. He wants to finish writing the book so he can disseminate his ideas and engage like and contrary minds in the discussion of those ideas. That is his goal in writing. Why should he be concerned if another person would want to create the same book, even if that other person was another version of himself? That book being worse, or having mistakes, or whether it was better or not, is irrelevant. If that book were to be written by a like-minded but competitive philosopher in the same world line as Lewis, that would not dissuade him from finishing his book, and so neither should it bother him if that person was on another world line, even if that philosopher was another version of himself. All Lewis can do is write or create a piece of work that is the best possible example of his idea, not because of how other people or versions will create or fail at creating the work, but simply because he wants to do it. This egocentric want also works for ethics. If you want to make the world better, you should go out and do it regardless of others who attempt to make it worse. You do this because you have a need or want to help others regardless of what others choose to do, even if those others are different versions of you in other places, or whether those places are actual or possible, or timelines apart, or worlds away. You do it because you have an egocentric want to do so. By the end of Steins Gate Zero, we see Okabe come to this conclusion himself, again evident in his redonning of the crisp white lab coat.
Behold my sacred white armor bestowed upon me by the fates! The moment my arms slide through their hallowed sheaths, I will truly awaken from my slumber!
Okabe chooses to want to save the world because it does matter to him. He is not a nihilist. He has egocentric wants, and he sent himself a video to the past encouraging himself to move to a world line in which he can save everyone he loves. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because his past and present self both want to live in a world where Kurisu and Mayuri both get to live, and there is no World War III. Plus, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a bit of arrogance in both versions of Okabe that would also want to try, just to see if it was possible to even create a paradox in time that would lead to the Steins Gate world line. Because the want to experiment with time, space, and time travel has always been their egocentric want anyway. Of course they would have a convoluted plan to do even more convoluted time travel, because that is the egocentric want that pushed them to try and create time travel in the first place. And it is the same want that they, or really he, embraces in order to disregard this modal realistic indifference towards the universe. And this is why Steins Gate just got a whole lot way smarter than you thought it was in the first place. And it was already way super smart. I didn't even talk about Nietzsche and the idea of eternal recurrence, which is totally what episode 12 and 13 are hinting at in the original season, or Heidegger, which they bring up a few times throughout the show. The show continues to blow my mind in crazy ways, like the way the show handled time travel to me was so novel the first time I watched it. Shifting timelines without going into the past was crazy, but then they add the time leap machine on top of that, and then they add physical time travel up to years and years. I love every character in the show because even the bad guys have deep and well thought out reasons for their decisions. The show likes to pull the rug out right when you think things are going well. So many gut punches. I really enjoy that most characters have a nickname that they throw around, like Ocarine or Hoenn Kiyoma or Mayushi and Ferris, just like a real group of friends would. I really love the relationship between Kurisu and Okabe. This is explored more in the movie, but it really makes you understand just how depressed Okabe is when Steins Gate Zero opens. At first I was convinced Zero would not be nearly as good as the first season because the original show had this self-contained package, and although it was not nearly as smart, it really did tie everything together nicely with some great new characters, and I will never say no to more Steins Gate, and I will never say no to more time travel. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. It was awesome to get to write an essay that directly ties into what I do my research in. I'd love to hear your theories on time travel down in the comments, or just, your thoughts on the show in general. If you enjoyed that, give us a like and subscribe, and share the video around if you can. You can always catch more awesome episodes of This Is a Thing every other week, new bonus casts, and our weekly podcast right here on Cinemaster's Ultimate Timeline.